We live in a universe of galaxies. Observations with optical telescopes have revealed this universe and the different types of galaxies that inhabit it. There are three basic kinds. One is the most familiar to us, spiral galaxies, consisting of a disk of stars, mostly young, mixed in with dust and gas, and a bulge of older stars near the center, and a diffuse halo of old stars and globular clusters. We see spiral galaxies in the universe at all different orientations. They're randomly distributed in three-dimensional space. Occasionally we'll look down on the disk as if from above, and occasionally we see it along its edge, where the dust lane that penetrates the disk is visible. The second major type of galaxies is an elliptical galaxy. Generally, these are larger and more massive. They're also simpler. Elliptical galaxies don't have a disk, and they have very small numbers of young stars and very little gas or dust. They're mostly old stellar populations. The final type of galaxies is really a catch-all for everything that doesn't fit the simple designation of spiral or elliptical. Irregular galaxies. The two nearest companions to the Milky Way galaxy and the two nearest external stellar systems are irregular galaxies called the Large and Small Magellanic Clouds, discovered in prehistory because they're naked-eye objects, though not visible from the northern hemisphere. These three major types of galaxies were all discovered in the early years of large telescopes about 100 years ago, even before their distances were understood or the fact that they were external systems were understood. William Herschel, for example, over 200 years ago, saw the beautiful spiral patterns of nebulae and speculated as to whether they were star-forming regions in our own galaxy or more distant universes of stars. When we look at images of galaxies from optical telescopes, the colors tell us something. Elliptical galaxies are red because they consist mostly of older and lower mass stars, late in their lifetime. Many of these galaxies formed 5 or 10 billion years ago, and almost all the stars in them are old. Spiral galaxies have a mixture of stellar populations. They have young stars. The Sun, remember, is only 1/3 the age of the Milky Way that it inhabits, and stars that are forming even as we speak in active star formation regions mixed with dust and gas. The final type of galaxies, irregulars, are also almost all young and appear blue or white in optical images. Many scientific fields start with taxonomy. Before we understood the mechanism of natural selection or the genetic basis of life, people categorized species by the way they looked and tried to look for patterns and similarities, and they grouped them. The groupings are still useful, but they don't reflect the underlying basis of life on Earth. Astronomers looking at the extragalactic universe also tried to make sense of galaxies by grouping them and looking for similarities. Edwin Hubble did a lot of this pioneering work in the 1920s and 1930s, and he tried to form relationships between the different types of galaxies that he thought might be an evolutionary sequence, where one type of galaxy evolves into another. We now know that Hubble's idea of an evolutionary sequence was wrong. He had no physical basis for it. The different types of galaxies typically do not turn into each other. But Hubble's way of categorizing galaxies by their morphology or appearance is still used today. In the morphological sequence of spiral galaxies, there are three major categories, called SA, SB, and SC. The Milky Way is the intermediate category of SB. The early type galaxies in the spiral sequence, the SAs, have very indistinct spiral arms, barely visible, and large bulges. The later types of the spiral sequence have more chaotic and visible spiral arms that eventually become ragged, and their bulges, or old stellar populations, are more modest. The elliptical galaxy sequence is a numbered sequence from E0 to E9, where the number reflects the departure from a spherical appearance on the sky. It turns out that most elliptical galaxies are not spherical in three-dimensional space, and so they project in 2 dimensions on an image to an elliptical form. E9s are the most elliptical in appearance, which can be 3 or 4 times longer than they are wide. The purest spherical ellipticals are E0s. The irregular galaxies don't have a simple categorization because they don't have strict patterns or regularity as the other two types of galaxies do. Apart from morphology, the most interesting thing to know about a galaxy is how old it is. The elliptical galaxies are mostly but not entirely old because of the old red stars that dominate their visible appearance. Spiral galaxies are hybrid systems. The oldest stars in the halo and the bulge are 10 or 11 billion years old. That's true of the Milky Way as well, whereas stars are still and continuously forming in the disk of the galaxy. Irregular galaxies are usually the youngest galaxies of all because almost all their stars are hot, blue, and young, perhaps hundreds of millions of years or up to a few billion years. The typical distance between any two galaxies in space is 10 or 20 times their diameters. But the long force of gravity, an inverse square law that never diminishes to zero, means that the reach is long and galaxies do interact, and occasionally they collide and merge. When galaxies interact, it's a long-scale gravitational dance. Stars are moved around in their orbits, and the galaxy's architecture is subtly changed over periods of hundreds of millions of years. If two galaxies came together, the stars in them would not collide because they occupy a tiny volume of the galaxy itself. But the stars would be heavily perturbed in their orbits, and the resulting system would look quite different from the two galaxies that came together. These long-term gravitational interactions take billions of years to play out in three-dimensional space, and computer simulations have shown how it would appear if two galaxies were about to merge or had just merged, and we can look for these examples on the sky. Although galaxy interactions and mergers take hundreds of millions or billions of years and we can't observe them happening in real time, we can piece together evolutionary sequences by looking around the sky for examples at different stages of this process. Galaxy interactions and mergers are a routine part of how galaxies behave, especially over the long time span since the Big Bang. There have been galaxies for over 13 billion years. And in that time, it seems that galaxies have grown by the merger of small pieces. We believe that structures in the universe started from small scales and then gradually developed up to larger scales. Finally, to the biggest systems we have, superclusters of galaxies containing tens of thousands of galaxies in regions hundreds of millions of light years across. There are three basic types of galaxies. Spiral galaxies like our own, consisting of a disk in uniform rotation, a central bulge of older stars, and a diffuse halo that contains most of the mass of the galaxy. Elliptical galaxies are simpler in their construction. They're nearly spherical systems consisting of old stellar populations, typically reddish stars, in swooping elliptical orbits at random orientations. The final type of galaxies, irregulars, is a catch-all for typically low-mass galaxies that have no particular pattern or symmetry, that are composed mostly of young stars mixed with gas and dust. These three types of galaxies exist in the universe with large space between them, but the long arm of gravity causes them to interact and occasionally even merge. During these mergers and interactions, the stars essentially never collide, but their architecture is changed as the stars are deviated in their orbits to form new configurations. When spiral galaxies merge, the result can often look like an elliptical galaxy.